A 7-year-old boy hurls snowballs in the frozen courtyard of a Brooklyn housing project, his breath forming clouds in the 1960 winter air. His hands are red from the cold, his jacket too thin, but he's laughing because childhood has a way of making you forget you're poor. Then his mother's voice cuts through the wind, calling him inside, and everything changes. What he's about to witness will haunt him for decades, fuel a multi-billion-dollar empire, and redefine how America drinks coffee. But right now, all he knows is that his father is lying on the couch, leg broken, face contorted in pain, and the terror in his mother's eyes is something he's never seen before. Fred Schultz wasn't a corporate executive or a Wall Street trader. He drove a diaper delivery truck through the brutal streets of New York, earning just over minimum wage, living paycheck to paycheck in a system designed to keep working-class families exactly where they were. On an icy winter day in 1960, he slipped while making a delivery, shattering his ankle so severely that he couldn't walk, couldn't work, and couldn't provide. No health insurance, no workers' compensation, no disability benefits, just a pregnant wife, 3 young kids, and a broken man staring at a ceiling in federally subsidized housing, wondering how they'd survive the next week, let alone the next month. Young Howard Schultz watched his mother, 7 months pregnant, collapse into a chair, her hands shaking as she tried to calculate bills that couldn't be paid with money they didn't have. His father had worked his entire adult life, breaking his back for employers who viewed him as disposable, a cog in a machine that ground up the poor and spit them out without a second thought. This wasn't a tragic accident in a system that cared. This was the system working exactly as designed. Extract maximum labor, provide minimum protection, and abandon workers the moment they become inconvenient. The image of his father, humiliated and helpless, branded itself into Howard's 7-year-old mind like a scar that would never fade. The Schultz family had no savings, no safety net, no wealthy relatives to call. They lived in Bayview Housing Projects, a sprawling complex of federally subsidized apartments where 150 families shared a single elevator, and the smell of boiled cabbage mixed with desperation in the hallways. Their 2-bedroom unit on the 7th floor was cramped, the walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing about the same bills, the same broken dreams, the same systemic poverty that trapped generation after generation. Fred Schultz had served his country in World War II, had worked every day of his adult life, had played by every rule society told him to follow, and his reward was a broken body, an empty bank account, and the soul-crushing realization that his labor had been worthless to the people who profited from it. But something else was born in that moment, something the housing project architects and the diaper delivery company executives couldn't have predicted. Watching his father suffer, watching his pregnant mother try to hold together a family with nothing but willpower and prayer, young Howard made a decision that he wouldn't fully articulate for decades. He would never let this happen to anyone under his watch. He would never be helpless. He would never allow dignity to be a luxury only the wealthy could afford. The shame of poverty, the indignity of watching his father beg for work he could no longer perform, the terror of food running out before the month ended. These became the fuel that would eventually power one of the most successful business empires in American history. Did Howard Schultz know, at 7 years old, that he'd one day build a company worth over $100 billion? Of course not. Did he understand that the trauma unfolding in that cramped apartment would become the foundation for revolutionary employee benefits that would redefine corporate America's relationship with its workers? Absolutely not. But the human mind is a strange and powerful thing. It takes pain and transforms it into purpose, converts humiliation into hunger, and alchemizes suffering into an unstoppable drive to prove that your existence matters, that your family's struggle wasn't meaningless, that the world that broke your father can be rebuilt into something better. The weeks after the accident were a masterclass in survival. Fred Schultz, unable to work, took whatever odd jobs he could find that didn't require standing. The family relied on the kindness of neighbors who were equally poor, sharing meals that were already too small, extending credit they couldn't afford to give. Howard's mother, heavily pregnant, took in sewing to earn a few extra dollars. The electricity got shut off twice. The humiliation of standing in line for government assistance, of watching his father's pride crumble a little more each day, of hearing whispered conversations about eviction. These weren't abstract lessons about inequality or economic injustice. This was Howard Schultz's daily reality, his education in what it means to be working poor in the richest country in the world. But here's the twist that makes this story more than just another rags-to-riches tale. The trauma didn't destroy him. It didn't make him bitter, didn't turn him into another statistic of generational poverty, didn't convince him that the system was too big to change. Instead, it gave him clarity. While other kids in Bayview were learning to accept their circumstances, to lower their expectations, to prepare for lives that looked exactly like their parents' lives, Howard was learning something different. He was learning that the only way out was up, that education and athletics and relentless hustle were the only tools available to break the cycle, and that staying in Bayview meant accepting a future he'd already watched destroy his father. Years later, when Howard Schultz would make the controversial decision to provide comprehensive health insurance to every Starbucks employee, including part-time baristas, Wall Street analysts would call it financial suicide. When he'd offer stock options to workers that most corporations considered expendable, business school professors would use it as a case study in misguided idealism. But if you want to understand why a CEO would make decisions that prioritize people over quarterly profits, you need to go back to that moment in 1960. You need to see a 7-year-old boy watching his father suffer because no one thought a diaper delivery driver deserved basic human dignity. You need to understand that billion-dollar empires aren't just built on business plans and market analysis. They're built on scars, on memories that refuse to fade, on the determination to ensure that no child ever has to watch their parent break the way Howard watched his father break. The snowball fight ended that day, but something else began. A poor kid from a housing project, born into circumstances designed to keep him exactly where he was, started making calculations that had nothing to do with money. How do you escape? How do you transform shame into fuel? How do you build something so big, so undeniable, so successful that you can rewrite the rules that destroyed your father? The answer would take decades to fully reveal itself, but it started here, in a cramped apartment on the 7th floor of Bayview Housing Projects, with a broken man on a couch, a terrified woman calculating impossible bills, and a 7-year-old boy who refused to accept that this was all life had to offer. What happens when that boy grows up? What kind of empire does trauma build? And more importantly, what does his story say about the empires you haven't built yet? June 7, 1956 marked the official completion of Bayview Houses, a sprawling monument to mid-century American optimism and systemic inequality built on 34 acres of Canarsie, Brooklyn. 23 8-story brick buildings rose from the ground like tombstones, housing 1,609 apartments designed for middle-income families who were one paycheck away from homelessness. The architecture was brutally efficient. 14% building coverage, 86% green space, wide-open courtyards that looked beautiful in the government promotional materials but felt exposed and vulnerable when you actually lived there. This wasn't luxury. This was warehousing the working poor with just enough dignity to keep them from rioting, just enough space to keep them from suffocating, and just enough hope to keep them paying rent they could barely afford. The Schultz family moved into their 2-bedroom unit on the 7th floor of one of those identical towers, joining roughly 3,487 other residents who called Bayview home. 150 families shared a single elevator that broke down constantly, forcing parents carrying groceries and strollers to climb 8 flights of stairs in summer heat that turned the stairwells into saunas. The walls were so thin you could hear Mrs. Rosenberg arguing with her husband about unpaid bills. Hear the Johnsons' baby crying at 3 in the morning. Hear every footstep, every slammed door, every whispered prayer of families drowning in the same financial quicksand. Privacy was a luxury, silence was impossible, and the constant reminder that your neighbors were struggling just as hard as you were somehow made it worse, not better. Bayview was bordered by Seaview Avenue, East 102nd Street, Shore Parkway, and Rockaway Parkway, a geographic cage that separated the projects from the rest of Brooklyn both physically and psychologically. The development was designed in the superblock style, bounded by local roads with no streets crossing through, creating an island of poverty that middle-class Brooklyn could drive past without ever entering. Ironically, the buildings offered spectacular views of Jamaica Bay's beauty, serving as a cruel contrast to the economic desperation contained within the brick towers. You could stand on your balcony and see water, sky, and possibility while knowing that escape required resources you didn't have, credentials you couldn't afford, and opportunities that seemed designed for everyone except the people who actually needed them. Fred Schultz worked as a truck driver for a diaper delivery company, coming home each night smelling of exhaust and disappointment, his body breaking down from repetitive labor that paid just enough to keep his family in subsidized housing but never enough to get them out. His wife, Bobby, stretched every dollar until it screamed, shopping for day-old bread, watering down milk, mending clothes until they couldn't be mended anymore. They weren't lazy. They weren't looking for handouts. They were playing by every rule capitalism pretended was fair, and their reward was a cramped apartment in a housing project where ambition went to die. The psychological toll of working full-time and still qualifying for federal housing assistance is something that wealthy people will never understand. The shame of knowing your best effort isn't good enough, the humiliation of government paperwork that treats poverty like a moral failing, the exhaustion of fighting a system rigged against you from birth. Young Howard absorbed it all. He watched his father leave before dawn and return after dark, watched his mother perform miracles with a nearly empty refrigerator, watched neighbors lose jobs and apartments and hope. The other kids in Bayview fell into two categories: those who accepted their circumstances as permanent and those who fought like hell to escape. Most fell into the first category, learning early that dreaming too big just made the reality hurt worse. But Howard was different, obsessed with sports, education, and the terrifying idea that staying in Bayview meant becoming his father. A good man ground into dust by a system that viewed working-class labor as expendable. The projects taught him that poverty wasn't a lack of character. It was a lack of options, a structural violence disguised as personal failure, an economic cage with invisible bars that most people couldn't even see, let alone escape. The social dynamics of Bayview were complex and brutal. There was pride in survival, community in shared struggle, but also resentment, comparison, and the constant calculation of who was doing slightly better or slightly worse. When someone got evicted, the whispers started. What did they do wrong? How did they fail? The implicit message was that poverty was a personal choice, that if you just worked harder, budgeted better, or wanted it more, you could climb out. This was a lie, of course, but it was a necessary lie because acknowledging that the system itself was broken meant acknowledging that no amount of individual effort might be enough. So families blamed themselves, blamed each other, and rarely blamed the corporate executives and politicians who designed an economy that required poverty to function, that needed a permanent underclass to keep wages low and workers desperate. Howard attended local public schools where teachers had already decided which kids were college material and which kids would end up in factories or dead-end service jobs. The tracking started early, the expectations were low, and the resources were minimal. But sports became his salvation and his obsession. Basketball courts in Canarsie Park became his second home, football fields became his battlefield, and athletic scholarships became his only realistic path to higher education. He wasn't the most talented kid on the court, but he was the hungriest, playing with a desperation that confused kids from stable homes. They played for fun, for glory, for the love of the game. Howard played for survival, for escape, for the chance to become something other than another Bayview statistic. The stigma of living in the projects followed him everywhere. When kids from middle-class neighborhoods learned where he lived, their attitudes shifted subtly. Less respect, lower expectations, the unspoken assumption that project kids were different, lesser, broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. Howard learned to lie about his address, to avoid conversations about family vacations he never took, to pretend he chose not to have things rather than admit he couldn't afford them. This constant performance of normalcy, this exhausting effort to hide poverty while surrounded by visible markers of it, created a psychological pressure that most people who've never experienced it will dismiss as sensitivity. But it's not. It's the daily grind of knowing that society has already written you off, that your zip code determines your worth, that the American dream is available to everyone except the people who actually need it. Years later, when Howard Schultz would build Starbucks into a global phenomenon and implement revolutionary employee benefits, critics would call it publicity stunt or misguided idealism. But if you want to understand why a CEO would prioritize worker dignity over maximum profit extraction, you need to understand Bayview. You need to understand what it feels like to watch your father work himself into an early grave for employers who viewed him as replaceable machinery. You need to understand the rage that comes from realizing your family's poverty wasn't a personal failure but a structural inevitability, that the system was designed to keep people exactly where they were, and that escaping required not just hard work but luck, timing, and a willingness to risk everything on the slim chance that merit might actually matter. Bayview Houses still stands today, still housing families struggling with the same challenges the Schultz family faced in the 1950s and 60s. The buildings are older, the paint is chipped, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Working families trapped in a cycle of subsidized housing because wages haven't kept pace with living costs, because corporate profits have been prioritized over worker security, because the same economic structures that broke Fred Schultz are still breaking fathers and mothers today. Howard Schultz escaped. Most didn't. And the question that haunts every success story born in poverty is this: why should escape require superhuman effort? Why should basic dignity be something you have to fight for rather than something guaranteed to anyone willing to work? And what does it say about your own life that you've probably never had to ask these questions? At 12 years old, Howard Schultz was already calculating escape routes. While other kids in Bayview were playing stickball and dreaming about nothing more ambitious than the next weekend, Howard was working a paper route before school, stacking newspapers in the freezing Brooklyn dawn, his fingers numb, his mind racing. The money was insignificant, a few dollars a week that barely covered his lunch expenses, but the principle was everything. Work equals money, money equals options, options equal escape. He wasn't saving for a new bike or comic books. He was saving for a future that didn't include cramped apartments, broken fathers, and the suffocating certainty that Bayview was designed to be a permanent address, not a temporary stop. But it was sports, not newspaper routes, that became his real ticket out. Basketball courts in Canarsie Park transformed into his sanctuary, the one place where talent mattered more than your address, where hustle could compensate for equipment you couldn't afford, where the scoreboard didn't care that your sneakers were 2 sizes too small and held together with duct tape. Howard wasn't the most naturally gifted athlete, wasn't the tallest or the fastest, but he played with a desperation that confused kids from stable homes. They played for fun, for the love of competition, for the simple joy of the game. Howard played like his life depended on it because it did. Every layup, every defensive stop, every win was proof that he was more than his zip code, more than another project kid destined for factory work or worse. Football became his obsession during high school at Canarsie High School, where he played quarterback with the same relentless intensity he brought to everything else. Coaches noticed not just his athletic ability but his work ethic, the way he showed up early and left late, the way he studied plays like they were scripture, the way he treated practice like a job he couldn't afford to lose, because that's exactly what it was. Athletic scholarships were rare, competitive, and represented the only realistic path to higher education for kids whose families couldn't afford college tuition. The middle-class kids on the team had backup plans, safety schools, parents who could write tuition checks if scholarships fell through. Howard had one plan, and if it failed, his future looked exactly like his father's past. Between sports practices and games, Howard worked. At 14, he was behind the counter at a local luncheonette, serving coffee and sandwiches to customers who rarely looked him in the eye. At 16, he took a job at a furrier in Manhattan's garment district, commuting into the city to work in conditions that would be illegal by modern standards. The work was exhausting, the pay was minimal, but every dollar went into a mental fund labeled escape. His classmates talked about prom dates and weekend parties while Howard calculated how many hours he needed to work to afford application fees for colleges he'd never visited. The psychological weight of carrying his family's hopes, of being the potential first in his family to attend college, of knowing that failure meant not just personal disappointment but confirming every low expectation society had for project kids. This was the invisible burden that drove him forward. 1971 brought the miracle he'd been fighting for. a football scholarship to Northern Michigan University, a school nearly 1,500 miles away from Brooklyn, situated in Marquette, Michigan, a small town on the shores of Lake Superior that might as well have been another planet. Northern Michigan University wasn't Harvard or Yale, wasn't the Ivy League dream that guidance counselors reserved for wealthy students, but it was accredited, legitimate, and most importantly, it was free. The scholarship covered tuition, room, and board, transforming an impossible dream into actual reality. His parents cried when he got the acceptance letter, not just from pride but from relief. Their son had found a way out, had beaten odds that broke most families, had proven that relentless work and athletic talent could occasionally overcome structural poverty. But here's where the story gets complicated, where the neat narrative of sports scholarship to success gets messy with reality. Howard arrived at Northern Michigan in the fall of 1971, a first-generation college student surrounded by kids who'd been preparing for higher education their entire lives. The culture shock was immediate and brutal. His classmates discussed summer vacations in Europe while Howard had spent his summer working double shifts at the Furrier. They complained about campus food while Howard considered it a luxury compared to the stretched meals of his childhood. The football program that had recruited him was competitive and demanding, and somewhere in that first year, reality hit. He wasn't going to be a professional athlete. An injury during practice made the decision for him, forcing him to confront the terrifying question. If sports weren't his path forward, what was? He joined Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity, finding community and connection, but the financial pressure never relented. The scholarship covered basics, but college life required money he didn't have. Textbooks, supplies, social activities, the thousand small expenses that middle-class students absorbed without thinking. Howard worked multiple jobs simultaneously, bartending at local establishments where he served drinks to students who spent more on weekend entertainment than his family spent on groceries for a month. Some accounts mention he even sold his blood plasma for extra cash, literally commodifying his body to stay enrolled. This wasn't the romanticized college experience of late-night philosophical debates and carefree exploration. This was survival, a continuation of the same relentless hustle that had defined his entire childhood, now transplanted to a college campus where most students had never questioned whether they'd eat that week. The isolation of being a first-generation, working-class student at a predominantly middle-class institution can't be overstated. Howard watched classmates change majors on a whim, drop classes without financial consequences, take unpaid internships because their parents could subsidize their living expenses. He couldn't afford any of those luxuries. Every class had to count, every credit had to move him toward graduation, every decision had to be calculated against limited resources and unlimited desperation. He majored in communications, a practical choice that could lead to corporate jobs, steady paychecks, and the kind of economic security his father had never experienced. The pressure of being his family's great hope, of carrying the dreams of parents who'd sacrificed everything, of representing the possibility that Project Kids could make it. This was the weight he carried alongside his textbooks. 1975 brought graduation, a bachelor's degree in communications, and the distinction of being the first Schultz to complete college. His parents attended the ceremony. His father Fred probably thinking about his own truncated education, his own broken body, his own unrealized dreams. The diploma wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that the system could be beaten, that poverty wasn't destiny, that a kid from Bayview Housing Projects could transform himself through sports, work, education, and sheer unbreakable will. But graduation also brought a terrifying question. Now what? He had credentials, education, and ambition, but no connections, no family business to join, no safety net if he failed. The corporate world beckoned, promising steady paychecks and middle-class stability, but Howard's relationship with safety had always been complicated. What he didn't know in 1975, walking across that graduation stage in Marquette, Michigan, was that the lessons learned in Bayview and refined at Northern Michigan University would eventually build a coffee empire that would redefine American consumer culture. The work ethic forged through paper routes and luncheonette shifts, the desperation refined on basketball courts and football fields, the financial calculation learned from watching every dollar. These weren't just survival skills. They were the foundation of a business philosophy that would prioritize employees over profit extraction, that would view workers as partners rather than expendable resources, that would prove compassionate capitalism wasn't an oxymoron but a competitive advantage. But that revolution was still years away. Right now, in 1975, he was just another recent graduate with student loans, limited connections, and the burning question every first-generation college student asks: did I escape, or am I about to discover that the cage is bigger than I thought? 1975 delivered Howard Schultz to the corporate world with a bachelor's degree, a mountain of student loan debt, and the terrifying realization that escaping Bayview was only the first battle. Fresh out of Northern Michigan University, he faced the same question every first-generation college graduate confronts. You've climbed out of poverty, but do you actually know how to navigate a world designed by, and for people who never had to claw their way up? The middle-class graduates had family connections, internships arranged through country club networks, parents who could make phone calls that opened doors. Howard had a degree, relentless work ethic, and the suffocating awareness that one misstep could send him right back to Brooklyn. Another cautionary tale about project kids who thought education alone could level a playing field that was never meant to be level. His first real corporate job came at Xerox, the document technology giant that dominated the photocopier market and ran one of the most respected sales training programs in America. Xerox didn't just hire salespeople. They manufactured them, putting recruits through intensive training that taught presentation skills, client relationship management, cold calling techniques, and the psychological warfare of enterprise sales. Howard was assigned to their New York sales division, where he sold word processors and office equipment to businesses that had budgets larger than his family's lifetime earnings. The culture shock was immediate and profound. His colleagues discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes while Howard was still sending money back to his parents in Brooklyn, still calculating every expense, still operating from a scarcity mindset that his middle-class peers couldn't comprehend. But Xerox was the perfect training ground for someone who'd spent his entire life proving he belonged in rooms that weren't designed for him. The sales training taught him to read people, to identify needs they didn't know they had, to present products as solutions rather than commodities. More importantly, it taught him that confidence could be performed, that authority could be projected, that the business world rewarded those who could speak the language of value creation and return on investment. Howard absorbed it all with the same intensity he'd brought to football practice and paper routes, understanding instinctively that these weren't just sales techniques. They were the codes and rituals of corporate America, the invisible curriculum that wealthy kids learned at dinner tables while project kids had to decode through trial and error. 3 years at Xerox transformed him from a recent graduate into a polished corporate professional, but the restlessness never subsided. He watched colleagues settle into comfortable careers, making decent salaries, climbing predictable ladders toward middle management positions that offered security but not significance. For someone who'd grown up watching his father's body break down from meaningless labor, the prospect of spending 40 years in a cubicle felt like trading one cage for another. The salary was better, the health insurance was comprehensive, but the existential question remained. Was this what he'd fought so hard to achieve? A comfortable corporate job that paid well but meant nothing, that generated profits for distant shareholders but created no lasting value, that offered financial security but spiritual emptiness? 1979 brought a pivotal move to Hammerplast, a Swedish housewares company that manufactured kitchen and bathroom products, including high-end drip coffee makers. Howard joined as vice president and general manager of their operations, a significant promotion that came with real responsibility and decision-making authority. The job required traveling to trade shows, managing relationships with retailers, analyzing sales data to identify growth opportunities. It was respectable work for a decent salary, the kind of stable corporate career that should have satisfied someone from his background. His parents were proud. His friends from Canarsie were impressed. But Howard couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a role in someone else's story, executing someone else's vision, building someone else's empire while his own potential remained unexplored. Then, in 1981, a curious anomaly appeared in the sales data that would change everything. A small coffee retailer in Seattle called Starbucks Coffee, Tea, and Spice was placing unusually large orders for Hammerplast strip coffee makers, outpacing major department stores and established retailers. The numbers didn't make sense. This wasn't a national chain or a well-funded corporation. It was a regional operation with just a handful of stores, yet they were moving product at a rate that suggested either a data entry error or something genuinely interesting. Most executives would have filed the report and moved on. Howard booked a flight to Seattle, driven by curiosity that his colleagues considered excessive and a restlessness that whispered this might be the opportunity he'd been unconsciously searching for. Seattle in 1981 was a far cry from Brooklyn. The city had a different energy, less aggressive, more laid back, surrounded by mountains and water in a way that made even urban spaces feel connected to. Pike Place Market, where Starbucks operated its flagship store, was a sensory explosion. Vendors selling fresh fish, produce stands overflowing with local vegetables, street musicians creating soundtrack ambience. And there, tucked into the market, was a small coffee shop that smelled like nothing Howard had ever experienced. The rich, complex aroma of freshly roasted coffee beans filled the space, and behind the counter, 3 guys talked about coffee with the passion usually reserved for art or religion. Jerry Baldwin, Gordon Boker, and Zev Siegel had founded Starbucks in 1971, naming it after the first mate in Moby Dick, focused obsessively on sourcing and roasting the highest quality coffee beans available. Howard spent the day absorbing everything: the careful explanation of different bean origins, the roasting process that transformed green beans into complex flavor profiles, the customer interactions that felt more like education than transaction. These weren't just retail workers moving product. They were evangelists for quality coffee, passionate educators helping customers understand the difference between commodity coffee and specialty beans. The business model was simple but limiting. They sold whole beans and equipment, teaching customers to brew quality coffee at home, but they weren't serving prepared beverages. They were educators in the coffee industry, not operators of a coffee house. Howard saw potential that the founders couldn't or wouldn't see, a vision that excited and frustrated him in equal measure. He returned to New York obsessed, calling the Starbucks founders repeatedly, pitching himself as someone who could help them expand, who understood marketing and retail operations, who saw the bigger picture they were missing. The founders were skeptical. They had a good business, a loyal customer base, and no interest in the aggressive expansion that Howard kept proposing. But his persistence eventually wore them down, and in 1982, they offered him a position as Director of Retail Operations and Marketing. The salary was lower than his Hammerplast position, the company was tiny compared to the Swedish corporation, and moving to Seattle meant leaving the East Coast entirely. Every rational calculation said it was a bad move. But Howard had learned something crucial during his years in corporate America. Rational calculations rarely account for the irrational power of purpose, passion, and the terrifying possibility that you might have found the vehicle for dreams you didn't even know you had. Joining Starbucks in 1982 meant accepting a pay cut, relocating across the country, and betting his career on a small regional coffee retailer that most people had never heard of. His friends thought he was crazy. His parents worried he was throwing away the stability they'd sacrificed to help him achieve. But Howard understood something that his Xerox training and Hammerplast experience had crystallized. Corporate ladders are invisible cages for people who lack the audacity to build their own. The real question wasn't whether Starbucks was a smart career move. The real question was whether he had the courage to transform a tiny coffee bean shop into something no one else could imagine, to risk everything he'd built on a vision that existed only in his mind. He'd escaped Bayview through sports and education. Now he was about to discover whether he could escape the gravitational pull of corporate safety, whether the kid from the projects had the audacity to build an empire rather than just work for one. And the answer, which would reveal itself over the next few years, would redefine not just his life but American coffee culture itself. But first, he needed to visit Italy. 1982 started like any other year in corporate America. Quarterly projections, sales reports, trade shows, and the numbing repetition of moving products that nobody truly needed from warehouses to retailers who didn't care. Howard Schultz sat in his Hammerplast office reviewing purchase orders when something unusual caught his attention, an anomaly in the data that most executives would have dismissed as clerical error or regional quirk. A small coffee retailer in Seattle called Starbucks Coffee, Tea, and Spice was ordering an absurd number of drip coffee makers, outpacing department stores with exponentially larger customer bases. The numbers suggested either a mistake in the system or something genuinely extraordinary happening 3,000 miles away. Most people would have sent a memo requesting clarification. Howard booked a flight to Seattle. Driven by curiosity, his colleagues considered excessive and a restlessness that refused to accept surface-level explanations. Seattle in early 1982 was experiencing its transformation from blue-collar industrial port city to the tech-forward cultural hub it would become, though the revolution was still years away. The city had a different energy than New York, less aggressive, more thoughtful, surrounded by mountains and water that made even urban environments feel connected to something larger. Pike Place Market, one of the oldest continuously operating public farmers markets in America, sprawled along the waterfront. A sensory explosion of fishmongers throwing salmon, produce vendors hawking local vegetables, craftspeople selling handmade goods, and street musicians creating atmospheric soundtrack to daily commerce. Tucked into this chaotic, vibrant marketplace was a small storefront with a distinctive logo, a twin-tailed siren rendered in brown and white, mysterious and compelling in ways Howard couldn't articulate. He pushed through the door and was immediately overwhelmed by an aroma he'd never experienced with such intensity. This wasn't the burnt, bitter smell of diner coffee or the chemical staleness of instant Maxwell House that filled American kitchens. This was rich, complex, almost intoxicating. The scent of freshly roasted coffee beans from different origins creating olfactory symphonies that suggested depth, craft, and obsessive attention to quality. Behind the counter stood three men who talked about coffee with the reverence usually reserved for wine or fine art. Jerry Baldwin, Gordon Boker, and Zev Siegel had founded Starbucks in 1971, naming it after Starbuck, the first mate in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, choosing a maritime reference for a city defined by water, fishing, and the romance of seafaring adventure. The founders weren't typical retail operators focused on margins and turnover rates. They were coffee evangelists, educators on a mission to transform American coffee culture one customer at a time by teaching people the difference between commodity garbage and specialty beans. They explained bean origins with the precision of geographers, Ethiopian Yirgacheffe with its floral notes, Sumatran Mandheling with its earthy body, Kenyan AA with its bright acidity. They discussed roasting profiles like master craftsmen explaining technique, the temperature curves that developed flavor, the precise moment to stop the roast before oils burned, the cooling process that locked in complexity. This wasn't a transaction. This was education, an initiation into a world Howard hadn't known existed, where coffee was craft rather than commodity, where preparation mattered, where quality justified premium pricing. Howard spent hours in that original store, absorbing everything, asking questions, watching customer interactions that felt more like consultations than sales. Customers didn't just buy coffee. They discussed it, compared notes on brewing methods, described flavor profiles they were seeking, treated the founders as trusted advisors guiding an exploration rather than vendors pushing product. The business model was simultaneously brilliant and limiting. Starbucks sold whole beans and brewing equipment, teaching customers to make exceptional coffee at home, but they weren't serving prepared beverages. They were retailers and educators, not operators of a coffee house. They had captured something precious, a passion for quality and a commitment to customer education, but they hadn't recognized the full potential of what they'd created. The founders explained their philosophy with pride tinged with defensive territorialism. They'd opened the first store at 2050 Pike Place in 1971, inspired by Alfred Peet, the Dutch-American coffee entrepreneur who'd founded Peet's Coffee and Tea in Berkeley, California, in 1966. Peet had revolutionized American coffee by importing high-quality beans and roasting them darker than conventional American roasters, and the Starbucks founders had essentially replicated his model in Seattle. They'd grown slowly and deliberately to 5 stores across the Seattle area, employed 85 people, operated their own roasting facility, and wholesale operations selling beans to local restaurants and retailers. It was a respectable regional business generating solid profits, and the founders were content with their achievement, proud of maintaining quality standards while growing at a pace they could control. But Howard saw something different, something the founders either couldn't or wouldn't see. He watched customers leave with bags of beans, imagining the ritual of brewing at home, and realized that Starbucks was solving only half the equation. Americans were notoriously lazy about preparation, conditioned by instant coffee and drive-through convenience to expect minimal effort. Teaching them to grind beans, measure water temperature, and execute proper brewing techniques was fighting against decades of cultural conditioning. But what if you removed the preparation barrier? What if you created a space where people could experience exceptional coffee without the homework, where the craft was performed by experts, where the customer simply showed up and was served? The founders were building a business. Howard saw the foundation for a revolution. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Back in New York, he called the founders repeatedly, pitching himself as someone who could help them expand, who understood marketing and retail operations, who saw growth opportunities they were missing. The founders were polite but skeptical, comfortable with their current trajectory, wary of outsiders proposing aggressive expansion that might compromise the quality standards they'd spent a decade building. But Howard's persistence was legendary, honed through years of proving he belonged in rooms designed for wealthier, better connected people. He kept calling, kept pitching, kept explaining his vision, until finally, out of exhaustion or curiosity or recognition that his passion might actually be valuable, they invited him to join the company. In 1982, Howard Schultz accepted a position as Director of Retail Operations and Marketing at Starbucks, taking a pay cut from his hammerplast salary, moving across the country to a city where he knew nobody, betting his career on a regional coffee retailer with 5 stores and a stubbornly limited vision. His wife Sherry, whom he'd married in 1982, supported the move despite its obvious risks, recognizing that her husband needed this in ways that transcended rational career calculation. His parents worried he was throwing away the stability they'd sacrificed to help him achieve. His former colleagues thought he'd lost his mind, abandoning a solid corporate career for a tiny Seattle startup in an industry with no obvious growth trajectory. But Howard understood something crucial that his critics missed. Xerox had taught him sales and presentation. Hammerplast had taught him product distribution and retail relationships. But neither had offered purpose beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder returns. Starbucks was different. It was small enough that his contributions would matter, focused enough that excellence was possible, and positioned at the intersection of quality, education, and untapped consumer desire in ways that made his entrepreneurial instincts scream opportunity. He didn't just want a job. He wanted to build something significant, to prove that the kid from Bayview could create value rather than just extract salary, to transform an industry rather than just participate in it. The first months were simultaneously exhilarating and frustrating. He worked closely with the founders, learning the coffee business from sourcing to roasting to retail operations, absorbing their passion while increasingly butting against their conservatism. They'd built something beautiful, but they'd also built walls around it, protective barriers that prevented the very expansion that could transform their regional success into national phenomenon. Howard kept pushing, kept suggesting, kept envisioning possibilities that the founders politely but firmly rejected. The tension was building toward an inevitable rupture, but neither side recognized it yet. They thought they'd hired a talented marketing director. Howard thought he'd found the vehicle for a vision that would eventually redefine how America consumed coffee, where people gathered, and what corporations owed their employees. But first, he needed to visit Italy, and what he'd discover there would change everything. Spring 1983 brought an unexpected assignment that would change the trajectory of American coffee culture, though nobody recognized it at the time. Howard Schultz needed to attend an international housewares show in Milan, Italy, a routine business trip to scout products, meet suppliers, and understand European retail trends. He booked his flights, arranged his hotel, packed his presentation materials, and prepared for what he assumed would be a few days of trade show tedium followed by the long flight back to Seattle. The universe, however, had different plans. What happened in Milan over those few days would ignite an obsession so powerful, so all-consuming, that it would eventually tear apart his relationship with the Starbucks founders, force him to risk everything he'd built, and ultimately transform how hundreds of millions of people around the world consumed coffee. Milan in the early morning was unlike anything Howard had experienced. Walking from his hotel to the convention center, he passed a small espresso bar tucked into a street corner, unremarkable in appearance but bustling with activity. Men in immaculate suits stood at the bar, drinking tiny cups of espresso in swift, ritualistic movements before rushing off to work. The barista behind the counter wasn't just an employee. He was a performer, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of coffee preparation, greeting regulars by name, remembering their preferences, executing each order with practiced precision and genuine warmth. The interaction lasted maybe 90 seconds per customer, but those 90 seconds contained something Howard had never witnessed in American retail: authentic human connection, community ritual, and the transformation of a commodity transaction into a moment of genuine pleasure. Intrigued, Howard returned to the same bar the next morning, then found himself seeking out different espresso bars throughout the day. He discovered that Milan had over 1,500 of these establishments, each serving as a neighborhood gathering place, a social hub where people connected before work, during breaks, after meetings. The espresso bars weren't just selling caffeine. They were selling belonging, ritual, a few minutes of refuge in the middle of chaotic urban life. Businessmen discussed deals, students debated philosophy, elderly couples enjoyed their morning routine, strangers became neighbors through the shared experience of exceptional coffee prepared with care. The baristas weren't minimum-wage workers grinding through shifts. They were skilled craftspeople, respected professionals who took pride in their work, who understood that they weren't just making coffee but facilitating community. The architecture of the experience was carefully calibrated. Most customers stood at the bar rather than sitting at tables, creating dynamic energy and turnover that made the spaces feel alive rather than static. The espresso was served in small ceramic cups, never paper, emphasizing quality and the importance of the moment. The preparation happened in full view, a transparent demonstration of craft that built trust and appreciation. The entire interaction, from order to completion, rarely exceeded 2 minutes, yet those 2 minutes felt significant, valuable, a pause that acknowledged your humanity rather than extracting your money as efficiently as possible. Howard stood in these bars, notebook in hand, sketching layouts, timing interactions, trying to decode the magic that made these spaces work. But it was the emotional dimension that truly captivated him. In America, coffee was utilitarian fuel, prepared badly and consumed quickly, a necessary evil to combat exhaustion rather than an experience worth savoring. Diners served it in thick mugs with unlimited refills, emphasizing quantity over quality, treating coffee as an afterthought. Office break rooms had vending machines or drip pots that sat on burners for hours, transforming already mediocre coffee into burnt sludge. The entire American relationship with coffee was functional, transactional, devoid of pleasure or ceremony. But in Milan, coffee was celebration, ritual, art. People didn't drink espresso because they needed caffeine. They drank it because the experience brought joy, because the barista knew their name, because stepping into their neighborhood espresso bar felt like coming home. Howard returned to his hotel each night buzzing with excitement that had nothing to do with caffeine. He'd found it, the missing piece, the vision that could transform Starbucks from a successful regional retailer into something unprecedented in American commerce. Starbucks already had quality beans, knowledgeable staff, and passionate customers. But they were selling homework, asking customers to do the work of grinding, measuring, brewing, cleaning. What if you removed all those barriers? What if you created American espresso bars modeled on the Italian experience? Spaces that weren't just about coffee but about community, connection, the third place between home and work where people could pause, breathe, belong? The idea consumed him completely, rewiring his understanding of what Starbucks could become, what role it could play in American life. He flew back to Seattle with fire in his eyes and a presentation prepared to convince the founders that they needed to pivot immediately. He scheduled a meeting, walked them through his Milan experience, explained the espresso bar model with the passion of a convert describing religious awakening. He showed them his sketches, his notes, his calculations of how many customers they could serve, how the economics would work, how this could scale nationally in ways that retail bean sales never could. The founders listened politely, asked a few questions, and then delivered the verdict that would change everything. No. They appreciated his enthusiasm, but Starbucks was a coffee bean retailer, not a restaurant. Serving prepared beverages would compromise their focus, dilute their brand, introduce operational complexity they didn't want. They'd built a successful business by staying in their lane, and they had no interest in Howard's Italian fantasies. The rejection stung more than he'd anticipated. This wasn't just a disagreement about business strategy. This was a fundamental disconnect about vision, purpose, potential. The founders saw a good regional business worth protecting. Howard saw the foundation for a national revolution, a chance to create something that didn't exist in America, to build spaces that modern urban life desperately needed. He tried again, pitched variations of the concept, suggested starting small with a single location as a test. The answer remained no. They'd hired him as director of marketing, not as a visionary to redirect the company. If he wanted to open espresso bars, he'd have to do it somewhere else. The tension escalated through late 1983 and into 1984, an uncomfortable stalemate where Howard couldn't let go of his vision and the founders couldn't embrace it. Years later, business schools would study this moment as a case study in innovation resistance, in how successful companies often miss transformative opportunities because those opportunities threaten their current model. The Starbucks founders weren't stupid or short-sighted. They'd built something valuable through focus and discipline, and Howard was proposing abandoning their proven formula for an untested concept based on his interpretation of Italian culture. From their perspective, they were being prudent, protecting what they'd built. From Howard's perspective, they were letting fear prevent transcendence, choosing comfortable good over terrifying great. The psychological tension of holding a vision that no one else shares, of seeing possibilities that everyone else dismisses, of knowing you're right while the world insists you're delusional. This is the loneliness of visionaries, the price of seeing around corners. But here's what makes this story more than just another tale of innovation versus conservatism. Howard wasn't some Silicon Valley entrepreneur with venture capital backing and wealthy parents as a safety net. He was a kid from the projects who'd fought for everything, who'd achieved security through corporate success, who had every rational reason to protect his stable director-level job at a profitable company. Walking away meant risking everything, meant starting over, meant potentially proving all the skeptics right who'd always doubted that project kids could build rather than just work. The safe move was to shut up, accept the founder's decision, continue collecting his salary, and let the vision die. But safety had never been Howard's primary motivation. Purpose was, and sometimes purpose requires burning down everything you've built to create space for what you're meant to become. The Milan trip had shown him what was possible, but the founder's rejection showed him what was necessary. He couldn't transform Starbucks from inside because the people who controlled it didn't share his vision. Which meant that if he wanted to prove the concept, if he wanted to create American espresso bars that brought Italian coffee culture to a country that desperately needed it, he'd have to leave Starbucks and build it himself. The decision terrified him, excited him, and confirmed something he'd always suspected. Sometimes the only way forward is to quit, to walk away from security, to risk catastrophic failure in pursuit of transcendent success. Did he know in 1984 that this decision would eventually make him a billionaire? That his vision would reshape American consumer culture, that he'd eventually buy Starbucks and merge it with his dream? Of course not. All he knew was that he'd seen the future in Milan, and he couldn't unsee it. What happens when vision becomes obligation? When seeing what could be makes accepting what is impossible? You jump, and Howard Schultz was about to jump into the abyss. 1985 began with the most terrifying decision of Howard Schultz's life. He was going to quit Starbucks, walk away from a stable director-level position at a profitable company, and start his own coffee house based on a vision inspired by Italian espresso bars that nobody in America believed would work. His wife Sherry was supportive but worried, watching her husband prepare to risk everything they'd built on a concept that every expert dismissed as impractical, culturally incompatible with American preferences, and financially unsustainable. The Starbucks founders thought he was making a catastrophic mistake, abandoning a good career for a delusional fantasy that would bankrupt him within a year. But Howard had learned something crucial growing up in Bayview. Sometimes the only path forward requires burning bridges, risking everything, and betting your entire future on a vision that exists only in your mind. But first, he needed money. Starting a coffee house required capital for lease deposits, equipment, inventory, renovations, and operating expenses until the business generated revenue. Howard had no family wealth to draw from, no trust fund, no wealthy relatives who could write checks. He'd spent his entire life working for salary, and while he'd been financially responsible, he hadn't accumulated the kind of capital needed to self-fund a startup, which meant he needed investors, people with money who'd be willing to bet on a kid from the projects with a crazy idea about bringing Italian coffee culture to America. He put together a business plan, practiced his pitch, and started the humiliating, soul-crushing process of asking wealthy people for money while knowing they could smell his desperation and working-class origins from across the conference table. The rejections started immediately and continued with brutal consistency. Howard pitched to 242 potential investors over the course of a year, enduring variations of the same dismissive responses. The concept was too European for American tastes. Coffee was a commodity business with razor-thin margins. Real estate costs in downtown Seattle were prohibitive. The market was saturated with existing coffee shops. He had no restaurant experience. The Italian espresso bar model wouldn't translate to American car culture. Each rejection chipped away at his confidence, confirming the voice in his head that whispered maybe everyone else was right, maybe he was delusional, maybe kids from housing projects should stick to corporate jobs and stop pretending they could build empires. But between each rejection, he'd remember Milan, the community he'd witnessed, the magic of those espresso bars, and he'd pick up the phone to schedule another pitch meeting. The psychological warfare of fundraising as a working-class entrepreneur cannot be overstated. Howard walked into offices in borrowed suits, pitching to venture capitalists and wealthy businesspeople who'd never questioned where their next meal was coming from, who treated million-dollar investments as portfolio diversification rather than life-altering bets. They asked condescending questions that revealed their assumptions. Did he understand restaurant operations? Had he studied failure rates in the food service industry? What made him think he could succeed where others had failed? The subtext was always the same. Who are you, a kid from Brooklyn with no pedigree, no connections, no track record, to think you can build something significant? Howard absorbed the skepticism, refined his pitch, and kept grinding, driven by the same relentless determination that had gotten him out of Bayview in the first place. Finally, painfully, he assembled enough investors to raise $1,600,000, cobbling together commitments from people who believed in him more than his concept. Some were fellow Starbucks employees who'd caught his passion. Some were local businesspeople intrigued by his intensity. Some were taking a flyer on a long shot, diversifying portfolios with high-risk, high-reward bets. The amount was barely adequate, leaving no margin for error, no cushion for mistakes, no room for the 1,000 unexpected expenses that destroy undercapitalized startups. But it was enough to begin, enough to sign a lease, enough to prove that his vision could translate from imagination to reality. In 1986, Howard Schultz opened Il Giornale, named after Milan's newspaper to honor the Italian inspiration, in the Columbia Center building at First Avenue and Cherry Street in downtown Seattle. The first Il Giornale location was 710 square feet of leased space in the lobby of Seattle's tallest office tower, a tiny footprint for enormous ambition. Howard had to personally guarantee the lease despite having no personal assets, signing documents that meant failure would destroy him financially for years. The interior design attempted to recreate Milan's aesthetic, standing bar for quick service, opera music playing, Italian menu terminology, dark roast espresso. He hired Dave Olson, a legendary Seattle coffee figure who ran Café Allegro, as head coffee buyer. Jennifer Ames Carmen joined as operations manager, and Howard himself worked behind the counter during opening weeks, pulling espresso shots, steaming milk, learning the craft while simultaneously managing the business, a level of operational involvement that most CEOs would consider beneath them, but that Howard saw as essential to understanding every aspect of the customer experience. But translating Italian coffee culture to America proved more complicated than Howard had anticipated. The opera music confused customers who expected rock or jazz. The Italian terminology intimidated people unfamiliar with espresso vocabulary. The standing bar felt rushed and uncomfortable to Americans accustomed to sitting. The 710-square-foot space was cramped, limiting how many customers could be served simultaneously. And Seattle's existing coffee culture, while more sophisticated than most American cities, still defaulted to drip coffee and large volumes rather than small, intense espresso servations. The first weeks were brutal, a constant negotiation between Howard's vision and customer reality, between authentic Italian experience and American expectations. He made adjustments, compromises, small pivots that maintained the core concept while acknowledging cultural differences. The economics were terrifying. Every day that Il Giornale operated, it burned through cash at rates that made Howard's stomach clench. Rent, payroll, inventory, utilities, marketing, equipment maintenance. The expenses were relentless and unforgiving. Revenue grew slowly, constrained by the small space and the time required to educate customers about espresso drinks they'd never ordered before. Howard lay awake calculating burn rates, projecting when they'd run out of money, gaming scenarios for raising additional capital if the first location didn't achieve profitability quickly enough. This wasn't the romanticized startup story of passionate entrepreneurs following their dreams. This was survival economics, every dollar scrutinized, every expense justified, the constant awareness that failure meant not just business closure but personal financial devastation and confirmation that his vision had been delusional all along. But something was working. Customers started returning, not just for the coffee but for the experience, the refuge, the few minutes of ritual in chaotic days. Office workers from the Columbia Center building made Il Giornale part of their morning routine. Business meetings happened at the bar. Strangers struck up conversations while waiting for drinks. The space was becoming what Howard had envisioned. A third place between work and home, a community hub, a gathering spot that served coffee but sold belonging. The average transaction was higher than conventional coffee shops because customers valued the quality and experience enough to pay premium prices. The unit economics, while challenging, suggested that the model could work if they could achieve sufficient volume and expand to additional locations where rent per square foot would be more favorable. Encouraged by the first location's performance, Howard opened a second Il Giornale in Seattle in early 1987, then a third in Vancouver, British Columbia, testing whether the concept could work outside Seattle. Each location refined the model, incorporating lessons learned, adjusting the experience to balance Italian authenticity with American preferences. The second and third locations had more seating, less insistence on standing bar service, music selections that reflected local preferences. Howard was learning to hold his core vision while remaining flexible on implementation, to know which elements were essential and which were negotiable. The feedback loop between locations accelerated learning, allowing rapid iteration in ways that single-location businesses couldn't achieve. Il Giornale was becoming proof of concept, demonstrating that American espresso bars modeled on Italian culture could work commercially, that customers would pay premium prices for exceptional coffee and community experience. Then came the news that changed everything. In March 1987, the original Starbucks founders decided to sell the company. Jerry Baldwin wanted to focus on Peet's Coffee, which he'd acquired in California. Gordon Boker wanted to pursue other ventures, including Red Hook Brewery. They put Starbucks, now grown to 6 stores plus a roasting operation, on the market for $3.8 million. Howard received the call with emotions he couldn't untangle. Vindication that the founders were exiting the business they'd refused to transform, opportunity to acquire the brand and infrastructure he needed, terror at the capital requirements, and the delicious irony that the employee they'd rejected might now become their buyer. This was the plot twist nobody had predicted. The guy who'd quit because they wouldn't embrace his vision now had the chance to buy them out and implement it anyway. But first, he needed to raise $3.8 million. And he had roughly 90 days to do it. What happened next would determine whether Howard Schultz's rebellion became revolution or cautionary tale, whether Il Giornale remained a small Seattle chain or became the foundation for transforming American coffee culture. The kid from Bayview who'd escaped through football, climbed through corporate America, quit to chase an Italian dream, and built a struggling three-location coffeehouse chain was about to attempt the ultimate acquisition. Buying his former employer, merging his vision with their brand, and betting everything on the possibility that America was ready for a coffee revolution it didn't know it needed. Did he know he'd succeed? Did he have any guarantee that investors would fund the acquisition, that the merger would work, that his vision would scale nationally? Of course not. All he had was conviction forged in Milan, refined through 242 rejections, and tempered by the knowledge that sometimes the biggest opportunities require the most terrifying leaps. And Howard Schultz had become an expert at jumping. March 1987 delivered the phone call that would rewrite the entire narrative. Jerry Baldwin was on the line with news that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. The original Starbucks founders had decided to sell the company. Baldwin wanted to focus his energy on Peet's Coffee in California, the spiritual grandfather of specialty coffee in America. Gordon Boker had other ventures demanding his attention, including Red Hook Brewery. After 16 years of building Starbucks from a single Pike Place market store into a respected regional chain with 6 Seattle locations and a roasting operation, they were ready to exit. The asking price was $3.8 million, and they were giving Howard first option to buy. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The employee they'd rejected, whose vision they'd dismissed as impractical Italian fantasy, now had the opportunity to acquire everything they'd built and implement the exact strategy they'd refused to embrace. But there was a monumental problem that threatened to transform opportunity into tragedy. Howard didn't have $3.8 million. Il Giornale was generating revenue but hadn't achieved the profitability that would allow him to secure traditional bank financing. He'd already exhausted most of his investor network, raising the initial $1,600,000 to start Il Giornale, and asking those same people for additional capital to acquire a separate company would test relationships and patience. The timeline was brutally compressed. He had roughly 90 days to raise $3.8 million or watch Starbucks get sold to someone else, potentially a competitor who'd recognize the brand's value and implement their own vision. The psychological pressure was suffocating, the kind that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning calculating scenarios, gaming alternatives, wondering if you're about to watch your dreams get purchased by someone with deeper pockets and better connections. The fundraising campaign that followed made his original Il Giornale effort look easy by comparison. Howard returned to existing Il Giornale investors, explaining that acquiring Starbucks would provide brand recognition, additional locations, and the roasting infrastructure that Il Giornale currently lacked. Some investors saw the logic and committed additional capital. Others were skeptical, worried that Howard was overextending, that combining 2 young companies would create operational chaos, that $3.8 million was too much to pay for 6 coffee shops and a roasting plant. He pitched new investors, leveraging Il Giornale's success as proof of concept, arguing that the merger would accelerate growth by 5 years. The rejections were familiar but no less painful, each no chipping away at the timeline, each closed door raising the probability that he'd lose this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Then came the complication that nearly destroyed everything. Sam Straum, one of Howard's original Il Giornale investors and a powerful figure in Seattle business circles, decided he wanted to buy Starbucks himself. Straum had the connections, the credibility, and the financial resources to mount a competing bid that could easily outmaneuver Howard. The betrayal stung worse than any investor rejection, the realization that someone from his own camp was now an adversary, that loyalty was negotiable when lucrative opportunities emerged. Howard found himself in a nightmare scenario, racing against a deadline while simultaneously competing against someone with advantages he couldn't match. The stress manifested physically, sleepless nights, constant anxiety, the suffocating awareness that this was the defining moment, that failure here would haunt him forever, that he might have to watch someone else build his vision using the exact assets he'd identified. But Howard had something Straum didn't. Relationships with the Starbucks founders built on years of working together, and a demonstrated commitment to their quality standards through Il Giornale's operations. He met with Baldwin and Boker, explained his vision for merging the companies, outlined how he'd preserve everything they'd built, while adding the coffeehouse experience they'd never embraced. The founders trusted him in ways they didn't trust Straum, recognizing that Howard understood coffee culture, appreciated their legacy, and had proven through Il Giornale that he could execute on the coffeehouse concept. That trust became Howard's competitive advantage, buying him time and consideration that pure capital couldn't purchase. Sometimes relationships matter more than money. Sometimes history provides leverage that spreadsheets can't calculate. Sometimes the invisible assets of reputation and trust determine outcomes in ways that purely financial analyses miss. Howard went back to his investor network with renewed urgency, painting the acquisition as existential rather than opportunistic. If he didn't buy Starbucks, someone else would, potentially a competitor who'd use the brand and infrastructure to crush Il Giornale. The merger wasn't just about growth. It was about survival, about preventing a scenario where his own success created a stronger competitor. This reframing worked, appealing to investors' self-interest rather than their faith in Howard's vision. New commitments trickled in, existing investors increased their stakes, and slowly, painfully, the $3.8 million target came into view. Among the crucial supporters was Bill Gates Sr., father of the Microsoft founder, a respected Seattle attorney who brought credibility and opened doors that had been closed. The social capital of having Gates Sr. as an investor was almost as valuable as his financial contribution, signaling to other wealthy Seattle businesspeople that this deal was legitimate, worthy, backed by serious people. On August 15, 1987, Howard Schultz completed the acquisition of Starbucks Coffee, Tea, and Spice. The transaction transferred ownership of 6 retail locations, the roasting plant, the Starbucks name, and all associated intellectual property to Howard's control. He merged the assets with Il Giornale, creating a combined entity that operated under the Starbucks name because brand consultants unanimously agreed that Starbucks had superior name recognition and cultural resonance compared to Il Giornale. The siren logo was redesigned, transitioning from brown to the now iconic green to symbolize the merger and new direction. Il Giornale's 3 locations were rebranded as Starbucks, creating a unified chain of 11 stores across Seattle and Vancouver. The company Howard now controlled had 85 employees, 11 locations, established supply chains, quality standards refined over 16 years, and his vision for transforming American coffee culture finally married to the infrastructure needed to execute at scale. The celebration was brief because the real work was just beginning. Merging 2 young companies with different cultures, different operational procedures, and different customer expectations required surgical precision and diplomatic skill. Former Starbucks employees were skeptical of the coffeehouse model, worried that serving espresso drinks would compromise the educational retail experience they'd perfected. Former Il Giornale employees were protective of the coffeehouse concept, concerned that merger would dilute the Italian inspiration. Howard had to navigate these tensions while simultaneously managing expansion, maintaining quality standards, preserving the best elements of both companies, and implementing his vision for what the merged entity could become. The psychological weight of finally having control, finally being able to execute without founders vetoing his proposals, came with the terrifying responsibility of proving he'd been right all along, that his vision was commercially viable, that he hadn't just acquired a company but positioned a revolution. The business plan Howard shared with his investors projected 125 stores within 5 years, a goal that seemed absurdly ambitious for a company that currently operated 11 locations. Wall Street analysts who bothered to notice scoffed at the projection, pointing out that specialty coffee was a niche market, that Americans preferred cheap convenience over quality experience, that the model couldn't possibly scale nationally. But Howard had learned something crucial through every rejection, every doubt, every skeptic who dismissed his vision. Conventional wisdom is usually wrong about genuinely transformative ideas precisely because those ideas challenge the assumptions that create conventional wisdom. The experts said Italian espresso bars wouldn't work in America until Il Giornale proved they would. The experts said specialty coffee couldn't justify premium pricing until Starbucks customers lined up to pay $3 for beverages that cost pennies at diners. The experts said coffeehouse culture was European, not American, until millions of Americans made Starbucks part of their daily ritual. The kid from Bayview Housing Projects who'd watched his father break under an employer's indifference now owned a coffee company positioned to redefine American consumer culture. The corporate employee who'd taken pay cuts and career risks to chase an Italian dream now controlled the brand, the infrastructure, and the vision to make that dream reality. The entrepreneur who'd endured 242 rejections to start Il Giornale, then scraped together $3.8 million to acquire Starbucks, now stood at the threshold of something unprecedented. 11 stores were about to become 100, then 1,000, then 10,000, spreading across America and eventually the world. But that explosive growth would only happen if Howard made one more controversial decision, one that Wall Street would call financial suicide, one that every business school would cite as evidence that he didn't understand capitalism. He was about to give comprehensive health insurance and stock options to part-time baristas. And that decision, more than any other, would prove that the trauma of Bayview hadn't just built ambition. It had built conscience. 1988 brought Howard Schultz face-to-face with the defining moral choice of his business career, the moment where he'd either replicate the corporate systems that had broken his father or build something fundamentally different. Starbucks was expanding rapidly, adding locations across Seattle and preparing for national growth, hiring baristas and shift supervisors and store managers at accelerating rates. The conventional wisdom was brutally clear: keep labor costs low, classify as many workers as possible as part-time to avoid benefit obligations, treat frontline employees as replaceable resources whose turnover was a budgeting line item rather than a human tragedy. Every business school taught these principles, every successful retailer implemented them, every Wall Street analyst demanded them. But Howard kept having flashbacks to 1960, to his father lying on that couch with a broken leg, to his pregnant mother's terror, to the soul-crushing realization that American capitalism viewed working-class labor as disposable machinery rather than human beings deserving dignity. The math was straightforward and damning. Most Starbucks employees were part-time baristas working 20 to 30 hours per week, making hourly wages that were decent by retail standards but hardly luxurious. Under conventional corporate practice, these workers received no health insurance, no stock options, no benefits beyond their hourly pay. If they got sick, they couldn't afford doctors. If they had families, their children went uninsured. If they wanted to build wealth, they had no mechanism for ownership or equity participation. The system was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum security, the exact dynamic that had destroyed Fred Schultz and traumatized his 7-year-old son. Howard could continue that system, maximizing short-term profits and shareholder returns by treating employees the way his father had been treated. Or he could do something that every advisor, every board member, every conventional business mind would call financial suicide. The board meetings were brutal. Howard proposed offering comprehensive health insurance to every Starbucks employee who worked at least 20 hours per week, including part-time baristas. The CFO presented calculations showing the cost would devastate margins, reduce profitability, make national expansion exponentially more expensive. Board members who'd invested their money based on conventional retail economics were apoplectic, arguing that Howard was prioritizing his personal trauma over fiduciary responsibility, that competitors would destroy Starbucks by maintaining lower cost structures, that Wall Street would punish the stock price for inefficient capital allocation. The pressure to abandon the proposal was overwhelming, a chorus of smart, experienced businesspeople explaining with charts and spreadsheets why compassion was incompatible with capitalism, why Howard's emotional baggage was clouding his judgment, why successful companies didn't waste resources on part-time workers who'd probably quit within a year anyway. But Howard understood something his critics didn't, something forged in Bayview and refined through years of watching corporate America treat workers as expendable. Employee turnover wasn't just a budgeting line item. It was a massive hidden cost that conventional accounting didn't capture. The expense of constantly recruiting and training replacements, the degraded customer experience when inexperienced baristas struggled with complex drink orders, the lost institutional knowledge when talented employees left for competitors who offered basic benefits. More fundamentally, Howard believed that treating employees with dignity would create loyalty, reduce turnover, improve service quality, and ultimately generate better financial returns than the race-to-the-bottom labor practices that defined retail. This wasn't naive idealism. This was a calculated bet that investing in people would produce competitive advantages that cost-cutting competitors couldn't replicate. In 1988, Howard Schultz implemented a revolutionary employee benefits program that business schools would study for decades. Every Starbucks employee working at least 20 hours per week received comprehensive health insurance covering medical, dental, and vision care. The coverage extended to domestic partners at a time when most companies didn't recognize same-sex relationships, making Starbucks one of the first major corporations to offer such progressive benefits. The program cost millions annually, dramatically impacted margins, and provoked exactly the Wall Street criticism that board members had predicted. Analysts called it unsustainable, competitors mocked it as public relations stunt, business journalists wrote articles questioning whether Howard understood basic retail economics. The pressure to reverse course was immense, but Howard had learned something crucial through every rejection, every skeptic, every expert who told him his vision wouldn't work. Sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that everyone else considers insane. Then came the stock option program that truly scandalized corporate America. Howard announced that Starbucks would grant stock options to every employee, including part-time baristas, based on base pay as a percentage of the option pool. The program, called Bean Stock, meant that 18-year-old baristas working 20 hours per week would receive equity ownership in the company, would directly benefit from Starbucks' growth, would become partners rather than employees. This wasn't how capitalism was supposed to work. Stock options were reserved for executives, senior management, maybe key employees whose departure would genuinely hurt the company. But giving equity to hourly workers who might quit after a few months? That was wealth redistribution disguised as corporate policy, socialism wearing a green apron, the kind of bleeding heart liberalism that destroyed shareholder value and rewarded mediocrity. At least that's what critics said. Howard called it creating a culture where everyone had skin in the game, where baristas cared about the company's success because they directly benefited from it, where the line between worker and owner blurred in ways that transformed motivation and loyalty. The results took time to manifest, but when they did, they vindicated Howard's gamble in ways that silenced most critics. Starbucks employee turnover rate dropped to 65% annually compared to 150 to 300% at comparable retail chains, saving millions in recruitment and training costs. Customer satisfaction scores improved as experienced baristas who actually cared about the company delivered better service than the revolving door of minimum wage workers at competitors. The Bean Stock program created thousands of employee millionaires over the following decades as Starbucks stock soared, generating loyalty and commitment that money alone couldn't buy. Partners, as Starbucks employees were now called, told customers about their stock options and health benefits, transforming frontline workers into brand ambassadors who genuinely believed in the company. The competitive advantage was exactly what Howard had predicted. You can't replicate a culture where people feel valued, where workers have dignity, where employment means partnership rather than exploitation. But the deeper vindication was moral rather than financial. Howard had broken the cycle that destroyed his father, had proven that capitalism didn't require treating workers as disposable, had demonstrated that profitability and compassion could coexist. Every barista who could afford to see a doctor, every partner whose stock options funded their children's education, every employee who felt valued rather than replaceable. These were living refutations of the conventional wisdom that maximizing profits required minimizing humanity. Business schools taught that shareholders came first, that fiduciary responsibility meant extracting maximum value from every resource including human labor. Howard built a counter-narrative showing that stakeholder capitalism, where employees mattered as much as shareholders, where dignity was a competitive advantage rather than a cost center, could outperform the exploitative models that dominated corporate America. The 1992 initial public offering validated the entire strategy. Starbucks went public at $17 per share, valuing the company at $271 million despite the supposedly inefficient labor practices that Wall Street had criticized. The IPO created instant millionaires among early employees who'd received stock options, proving that treating workers as partners rather than expenses distributed wealth rather than concentrating it. The media coverage focused on Howard's unconventional approach, the health insurance for part-timers, the stock options for baristas, the radical notion that a retail company could be built on dignity rather than exploitation. Some analysts remained skeptical, predicting that competitors with lower cost structures would eventually crush Starbucks. But Howard understood something they didn't. The moat he'd built wasn't based on proprietary technology or exclusive supply chains. It was based on culture, on creating an organization where talented people wanted to work, where employment meant something beyond hourly wages, where the company's success was genuinely shared rather than hoarded by executives and shareholders. Years later, when Starbucks had grown to thousands of locations and Howard's net worth exceeded billions, critics would dismiss the employee benefits as easy generosity from someone who could afford it. But that narrative reversed causality. Howard didn't implement revolutionary benefits after becoming wealthy. He became wealthy because he implemented revolutionary benefits that created competitive advantages competitors couldn't replicate. The health insurance and stock options weren't acts of charity. They were strategic investments in human capital that generated returns conventional accounting couldn't measure but financial results ultimately confirmed. The kid from Bayview who'd watched capitalism break his father had figured out how to build a different kind of capitalism. One where profit and purpose weren't opposites but partners, where treating people with dignity was the foundation rather than the obstacle to success. And that lesson, more than the coffee or the stores or the billions in market capitalization, would become Howard Schultz's most enduring legacy. But first, the company had to scale from 11 stores to global domination. And that explosive growth story was about to rewrite the rules of American retail. August 1987 marked the beginning of an expansion so rapid, so unprecedented, so transformative that business historians would spend decades analyzing how a small Seattle coffee chain became a global phenomenon that redefined consumer culture across continents. Howard Schultz stood at the helm of a merged company with 11 stores, 85 employees, revolutionary employee benefits that Wall Street called unsustainable, and a vision that most people still considered delusional. The business plan projected 125 stores within 5 years, a target that seemed absurdly ambitious but that Howard would not only meet but shatter. What followed was a masterclass in scaling culture, maintaining quality during explosive growth, and proving that compassionate capitalism could outperform the exploitative models that dominated corporate America. The kid from Bayview was about to build an empire that would employ hundreds of thousands, serve billions of customers, and generate wealth that would have been incomprehensible to the family living on the 7th floor of a housing project. The expansion strategy was simultaneously aggressive and disciplined, opening new stores at a pace that tested operational capacity while refusing to compromise on quality standards or employee benefits. 1988 brought 33 stores. 1989 added 55 more. 1990 saw 116 total locations. The growth wasn't random geographic sprawl but calculated market penetration, clustering stores in urban centers to achieve brand dominance, leveraging economies of scale in roasting and distribution, creating density that made each new store more profitable than isolated locations could be. Critics predicted cannibalization, arguing that opening multiple Starbucks in the same neighborhood would split revenue and destroy unit economics. But Howard understood something they didn't. Great coffee and community experience weren't zero-sum commodities. Customers didn't visit one Starbucks per day because that was all the coffee they wanted. They visited the most convenient location at that moment, and having multiple options increased total consumption rather than merely redistributing it. June 19, 1992 brought the initial public offering that validated everything Howard had built and proved that stakeholder capitalism could generate extraordinary financial returns. Starbucks went public at $17 per share on the NASDAQ exchange under the ticker symbol SBUX, raising $25 million and valuing the company at $271 million. The IPO created instant millionaires among early employees who'd received stock options, distributing wealth in ways that conventional corporations considered wasteful, but that Howard saw as fulfilling promises made to partners who'd believed in the vision. Baristas who'd served espresso in the Columbia Center Il Jornal location now had stock portfolios. Shift supervisors who'd worked opening shifts became homeowners. The market capitalization would eventually exceed $100 billion, making Starbucks more valuable than most Fortune 500 companies and generating returns that made early investors extraordinarily wealthy. But the real validation wasn't the stock price. It was the proof that treating employees with dignity didn't prevent financial success. It enabled it. The 1990s brought expansion beyond Seattle, beyond the Pacific Northwest, beyond the United States, transforming Starbucks from regional phenomenon to global brand. Stores opened in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, major metropolitan markets where coffee culture already existed, but where Starbucks' experience-focused model offered something different. International expansion began in 1996 with stores in Japan, followed by Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, eventually reaching over 80 countries. Each market required cultural adaptation, understanding local preferences while maintaining core quality standards, balancing global consistency with regional relevance. The green siren logo became as recognizable globally as Coca-Cola or McDonald's. But unlike those brands that competed primarily on price and convenience, Starbucks competed on experience, quality, and the aspirational identity that came from consuming premium products in thoughtfully designed spaces. 2000 brought a transition that seemed like the natural culmination of Howard's journey. He stepped down as CEO, transitioning to chairman and chief global strategist, allowing Orrin Smith to take operational control. For someone who'd fought so hard to build Starbucks, the decision to step back required trusting that the culture he'd created could survive without his daily involvement, that the values embedded in the organization were stronger than any individual leader. The transition seemed successful initially, with continued growth and profitability. But by 2008, Starbucks was struggling, having grown too fast, lost focus on customer experience, allowed operational efficiency to compromise the magic that made the store special. The stock price collapsed during the financial crisis, same-store sales declined, and the company that had seemed invincible suddenly looked mortal. The board asked Howard to return as CEO, and in January 2008, he came back to save the company he'd built. The 2008 comeback became legendary, a demonstration that authentic leadership focused on culture and values could resurrect a struggling corporation. Howard's first major decision was shocking. On February 26, 2008, he closed all 7,100 Starbucks stores simultaneously for 3 hours to retrain 135,000 baristas on how to make the perfect espresso. The move cost millions in lost revenue, disrupted customer routines, and seemed insane to analysts who thought training could happen during off hours without dramatic closures. But Howard understood that the gesture was more important than the training content. He was signaling that quality mattered more than quarterly profits, that the company would sacrifice short-term revenue to restore long-term excellence, that Starbucks was recommitting to the standards that had made it special. The media coverage was massive, customers applauded the dedication to quality, and the symbolic reset marked the beginning of a turnaround that would see the stock price increase 16 times over the following years. The comeback strategy focused on stripping away the distractions that had diluted the brand, closing underperforming stores, eliminating product lines that didn't align with core values, reinvesting in store design and employee training. Howard also doubled down on social responsibility initiatives that reflected his values and differentiated Starbucks from competitors focused solely on profit maximization. The company committed to hiring 10,000 military veterans and spouses, eventually exceeding 30,000. Starbucks launched a college tuition program providing full scholarships for employees to complete bachelor's degrees through Arizona State University's online program. The company prioritized sustainable sourcing, ethical treatment of coffee farmers, environmental responsibility, becoming a leader in corporate social responsibility that proved progressive values could coexist with profitability. Critics called it public relations, but the results suggested something deeper. Customers increasingly preferred companies that shared their values, employees stayed longer at organizations that treated them with dignity, and stakeholder capitalism outperformed shareholder capitalism in building sustainable competitive advantages. By 2017, when Howard stepped down as CEO for the second time, Starbucks operated 28,000 stores across 77 countries, employed over 330,000 partners, generated over $22 billion in annual revenue, and maintained a market capitalization that fluctuated between $70 and $100 billion depending on market conditions. The company had survived recessions, coffee price fluctuations, increased competition, changing consumer preferences, and numerous challenges that destroyed lesser organizations. What began as a 7-year-old boy watching his father suffer with a broken leg had become a global corporation that proved capitalism could be built on dignity rather than exploitation, that employee benefits were investments rather than costs, that purpose and profit could coexist. Thousands of employees became millionaires through Beanstalk. Millions of customers found third places that offered refuge from chaotic modern life. Billions of dollars in wages and benefits flowed to workers who conventional business wisdom considered unworthy of investment. But the deeper legacy transcends numbers, revenue, store counts, market capitalization. Howard Schultz proved that your origins don't determine your destination, that housing projects produce visionaries as often as country clubs, that trauma can become fuel rather than limitation. He demonstrated that seeing differently isn't enough. You must have the courage to act on vision despite unanimous skepticism, to risk everything when everyone says you're wrong, to persist through rejections that would break most people. He showed that business can be a force for good, that corporations can prioritize stakeholders over shareholders and still generate extraordinary returns, that treating employees with dignity creates competitive advantages that cost-cutting competitors cannot replicate. Most importantly, he lived proof that the systems that break your parents aren't inevitable, that you can build different structures, that one person with conviction can transform industries and impact millions of lives. The question that haunts every transformative success story is this: what made Howard different? Was it intelligence? Thousands of people from Bayview were equally smart. Was it work ethic? Plenty of project kids worked just as hard. Was it luck? Certainly timing and circumstance played roles. But the real differentiator was probably simpler and more replicable than we want to admit. He refused to accept that the world as it existed was the world as it had to be. He saw Italian espresso bars and imagined them in America despite everyone saying it wouldn't work. He experienced corporate indifference to workers and built a company that treated employees as partners despite everyone saying it was unsustainable. He faced rejection after rejection and kept pitching because the vision was stronger than the doubt. That refusal to accept limitations, that commitment to building what should exist rather than accepting what does exist, that willingness to risk everything on conviction. These aren't genetic gifts or privileges of wealth. They're choices available to anyone willing to pay the price of uncertainty, rejection, and the terrifying possibility of failure. So here's the final question, the one that matters more than Howard's billions or Starbucks' thousands of stores. What are you refusing to accept about the world you inhabit? What vision have you glimpsed that everyone else dismisses as impossible? What empire are you not building because you're waiting for permission, resources, or certainty that will never come? Howard Schultz's story isn't inspiration porn designed to make you feel good about inequality. It's a blueprint showing that transformation requires seeing differently and acting despite fear. The housing projects produced one Howard Schultz. How many potential empire builders are still there, still trapped, because no one showed them that escape requires risking everything on visions that exist only in your mind? Your move. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their circumstances don't define their potential. Subscribe for more stories of transformation that challenge what you think is possible. And most importantly, stop waiting for permission to build what you see. The world doesn't need another person accepting limitations. It needs builders who refuse to.